My name is Caleb Hart. I spent 14 years in the Army working on communication systems in places where equipment usually failed at the worst possible moment. I repaired radios in sandstorms, rebuilt antenna systems while mortars landed nearby, and once kept a damaged field network running for 36 hours using stripped copper wire and parts taken from 2 destroyed transmitters. I was a technician, not an infantry soldier, but that difference stopped meaning much whenever our position came under attack. I learned how to use a rifle, how to move while people were shooting at me, and how to keep my hands steady when the rest of my body wanted to give in to fear. After leaving the Army, I discovered that civilian employers liked hearing about my military experience more than they liked paying me for it. For several years, I moved between short contracts, restoring storm-damaged radio sites, replacing microwave links on mountain ridges, and repairing emergency systems in towns too small to employ a full-time technician. The work was irregular, uncomfortable, and often lonely, but I understood it. Machines did not lie about what was wrong with them. If a system failed, there was always a broken connection somewhere. Find it, repair it, and the problem ended. That was why Valine Emergency Systems contacted me about Rookfall Ridge. The station stood in the mountains of northern Idaho, close enough to the Montana border that the project maps included emergency frequencies for both states. It had been abandoned for 11 years after a newer network made it unnecessary, but 2 terrible wildfire seasons and several major communication failures had convinced the state to bring it back. Once restored, the relay would provide emergency coverage across nearly 60 miles of forest, logging roads, and isolated communities. Valine had promised to complete the project before the height of fire season, but according to the project manager, they were already 3 weeks behind schedule. The contract was supposed to last 8 days. In addition to my normal rate, Valine offered me an $18,000 completion bonus if we brought the tower and its control system online before the following Friday. That amount should have warned me that this was more than an ordinary repair job, but I had spent the previous 2 months watching unpaid invoices pile up while the balance in my bank account slowly disappeared. $18,000 was enough to silence most of the questions I should have asked. The project manager was a man named Richard Sloan. He told me I had been selected because the relay station was considered critical infrastructure and because Valine needed someone who could operate without outside support. During our final phone call, he said, "Your military background made the difference, Caleb. You know remote communication systems, you've worked under pressure, and you won't freeze if conditions become dangerous. This is a high-stakes restoration. We need someone who can make decisions without waiting for permission." Sloan also told me the company was sending 2 armed wilderness security contractors with us. When I asked why a communication crew required armed protection, he mentioned black bears, mountain lions, illegal hunters, and the long distance from law enforcement. None of that sounded unreasonable. Remote tower crews sometimes carried rifles, and an armed escort was cheaper than explaining a dead technician to an insurance company. I accepted the contract that afternoon. There were 4 of us in total. Eli Navarro was the second technician, a certified tower climber who had spent most of his adult life hanging above places sensible people preferred to view from the ground. He was 31, thin, restless, and unable to look at a tower without planning how he would climb it. Everything above the equipment building roof was his responsibility, including the feed lines, antennas, microwave dishes, mounting equipment, and the steel tower itself. Warren Pike led security. He was 52 and had worked as a game warden and search and rescue coordinator before moving into private security. Warren spoke quietly, noticed everything, and carried an old bolt-action rifle that looked worn enough to have become part of him. Jonah Shaw, the second security man, was 38, broad through the shoulders and far more talkative than Warren. He had guided hunting parties in Alaska, protected geological survey crews, and spent 3 winters working at a remote mine where wolves sometimes followed employees between buildings. Both men understood the wilderness better than Eli or I ever would. We met at Valine's equipment yard shortly before sunrise on a Monday. Our only vehicle was a heavy four-wheel-drive crew cab truck pulling a utility trailer loaded with replacement batteries, cables, climbing equipment, tools, food, and a portable winch. A satellite communication terminal had been installed in the truck's center console because there was no cellular service within 40 miles of the relay station. Veerline also issued us a one-way emergency beacon. The beacon could transmit our location to search and rescue satellites, but it could not receive messages or tell us when help was coming. Sloan called it a second safety system. Warren examined the device and said it was what companies gave crews when they did not want to pay for a second vehicle. The first 6 hours of our journey took us along paved roads through towns that became smaller and farther apart. After our final fuel stop, the highway narrowed, the houses disappeared, and the mountains closed around us. We turned onto an old logging road where the pavement ended, then followed Veerline's map through 38 miles of broken gravel, washed-out drainage channels, and narrow turns cut into steep forested slopes. Spruce and cedar trees pressed close enough to scrape both sides of the trailer. In several places, Eli and Jonah had to walk ahead and remove fallen branches, while I guided the truck around holes deep enough to swallow a tire. The journey took almost 3 hours longer than Sloan had estimated. By the time we reached Rookfall Ridge, it was late afternoon. Heavy clouds had dropped low over the mountains, turning the upper trees into dark shapes inside the mist. The relay compound occupied a narrow clearing close to the top of the ridge. A 160-foot steel lattice tower rose above the trees, held upright by 3 groups of heavy support cables anchored into the ground. Several microwave dishes clung to its upper sections like pale, blind eyes. An 8-foot chain-link fence surrounded the base of the tower, a reinforced concrete equipment building, a diesel generator enclosure, and 2 rusting fuel tanks. The old maintenance cabin stood roughly 400 yards downhill from the compound. A narrow service track connected the 2 clearings, but thick forest filled most of the space between them. One rough access road led back toward civilization. After the slow drive through the mountains, the distance between us and the nearest town felt much greater than it had on a map. Nothing about Rookfall Ridge appeared immediately dangerous. It simply looked forgotten. Weeds had grown through the gravel inside the compound. One section of fence leaned inward under the weight of a fallen branch. Rust marked the tower bolts, moss covered the concrete foundations, and several roof panels on the generator enclosure had begun to bend. The maintenance cabin looked slightly better, although its roof sagged near the chimney. The air smelled of wet soil, old pine, and the faint metal scent that gathers around abandoned machinery. Eli stepped out of the truck and stared at the tower for several seconds. He removed his sunglasses, looked up again, and said, "Sloan described the corrosion as cosmetic." I closed the driver's door and followed his gaze. Several dark lines ran down from the upper joints, and one of the microwave dishes appeared to be leaning away from its mounting frame. Sloan also said the job would take 8 days, I reminded him. While Eli continued examining the tower, Warren walked toward the generator enclosure. He did not answer when Jonah asked what he thought of the site. Instead, he crouched beside the steel door and examined 4 long scratches running across the faded paint. The marks started approximately 5 feet above the ground and ended close to 8 feet high. They were old enough to have rust inside them, but each groove had cut through several layers of paint and deep into the metal. Eli came over and looked at the marks. Could a bear have done that? Warren moved one finger beside the highest scratch without touching it. Maybe, he answered. Jonah gave a small smile and said, "When Warren says maybe, it usually means no." "It means I don't know." Warren stood and looked toward the wall of trees surrounding the compound. A bear usually leaves more damage when it tries to open something. These scratches are too clean, and there isn't any damage near the lock. There was no food inside the generator enclosure, and the door did not appear to have been forced. I suggested that the marks might have been caused by a piece of heavy equipment passing too close to the building years earlier. Eli agreed that it was possible. Warren said nothing, but we accepted the explanation because accepting it allowed us to continue working. The maintenance cabin was in better condition inside than it appeared from the clearing. It contained 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, a common room with a wood stove, and a narrow storage room at the rear. Steel shutters covered the windows, although several of their hinges had become stiff with rust. An old propane system supplied the stove and 2 wall lamps. We tested the gas lines, checked for leaks, swept out rodent droppings, and unloaded enough food and equipment to last several days. By sunset, Jonah had started a fire, and Eli had discovered an old metal coffee pot inside one of the cabinets. The cabin became warmer, but the smell of damp wood never completely disappeared. Rain began tapping against the roof while the 4 of us ate canned stew around a scratched wooden table and discussed the condition of the station. The generator starter had seized. Half of the batteries inside the control building had split after years of freezing. Water had entered one transmitter cabinet and several control boards were covered with white corrosion. One microwave dish had moved several degrees away from its correct position. A long section of feed cable had also been torn loose from the tower at approximately 60 feet. Eli estimated that he would need 2 climbing days if the tower passed its safety inspection. I believed I would need at least 3 days to clean the equipment room, repair the power system, and determine which transmitters could still be used. Jonah looked from Eli to me before asking, "Is 8 days still possible?" "Ask me after I open the rest of the cabinets," I replied. "If the internal equipment stayed dry, we have a chance. If water reached the main control rack, Veerline sent us here with half the parts we need." Warren sat nearest the front window, even though the shutter was closed. He studied a small weather receiver while we spoke and informed us that the storm would become stronger the following afternoon. Heavy rain was expected to continue through Wednesday morning, with strong winds at higher elevations. Eli drank his coffee and asked, "Are you always this cheerful?" "Only when I'm being paid," Warren answered. The rain became heavier after midnight. I woke several times to branches rubbing against the cabin walls and water dripping into a metal pan near the stove. At approximately 3 in the morning, a heavy metallic sound came from somewhere outside. It was not particularly loud, but it carried clearly through the cabin. I heard a slow groan as if metal were bending, followed by a dull impact. Warren was awake before I left my bed. I heard his boots moving quietly across the floor and saw his shadow pass my open bedroom door. By the time I entered the common room, he had put on his coat, extinguished the nearest propane lamp, and opened the small viewing slit in the front window shutter. I whispered, "What was that?" He raised one hand and signalled for me to remain silent. For nearly a minute, we listened. Rain struck the roof, and the wind moved through the forest with a long rushing sound. Beyond that, I heard nothing. Jonah entered carrying a flashlight and his shotgun. Eli appeared behind him, still pulling on his jacket. Warren moved the wooden bar from the door while Jonah stood to one side with the shotgun ready. After opening the door, Warren remained inside as Jonah aimed the flashlight into the clearing. The beam passed over the truck, utility trailer, woodshed, and wet service track. Nothing moved. Warren stepped onto the porch and looked in both directions. Less than 30 seconds later, he came back inside and closed the door. Jonah lowered the shotgun and suggested that a branch had probably fallen against the trailer. Warren returned the wooden bar to its place and said, "Probably," although his expression showed that he did not believe it. I returned to bed, but did not sleep well. Several times during the remaining hours of darkness, I thought I heard something heavy moving across the wet ground behind the cabin. Whenever I held my breath and listened, the sound became lost beneath the rain. I eventually convinced myself that I was hearing water fall from the roof or wind pushing against the woodshed. We discovered the truck shortly after sunrise. The hood had been bent upward from the front, as though someone had forced both hands beneath it and pulled until the latch tore through the metal. The battery had been crushed inside its mounting bracket. Thick cables had been ripped from the engine, the radiator had been punctured, and the main wiring system hung in pieces. All 4 tires had been cut open along their sidewalls by several long parallel marks. The driver's door had also been forced open. The metal surrounding the lock was bent, and the door no longer closed properly. Inside the cab, the satellite terminal had been smashed through the dashboard. Its antenna cable had been pulled through the rear panel and cut apart. The screen was broken, the control unit was crushed, and several pieces lay on the floor beneath the passenger seat. Nothing had been stolen. The utility trailer remained locked, and the food inside the truck had not been touched. Whoever or whatever had done it had destroyed the engine, the tires, and our only method of speaking to the outside world. It had then left every other piece of equipment exactly where it was. Eli stared at the folded hood and said, "A person couldn't do that without tools." "A person with a heavy bar might," Jonah replied, although his voice showed that he did not believe his own explanation. Warren crouched beside the left front tire. The rain had softened the ground, but the gravel around the truck made clear tracks difficult to find. He moved slowly along the edge of the service road until he found a deep impression in the mud. After clearing away some of the water with the side of his hand, he called us over. At first, I thought the track belonged to a bear. Then I noticed its length and the 5 narrow toe marks ending in deep points. The rear portion was long, almost like the heel of a human foot, but far too large. A second track lay approximately 6 feet away from the first. Warren removed a folding rule from his pocket and measured the clearer print. 17 inches, he said, maybe slightly more before the rain damaged it. Jonah walked farther along the road until he located another impression. He studied the distance between the tracks and said, "The stride is wrong for a bear. There should be front and rear prints, especially in mud this soft." I looked from one print to the next. Could a bear have stood up and walked for a while? Warren turned toward the cabin and followed the tracks with his eyes. It didn't walk for a while. Whatever made these approach the truck on 2 legs circled it and left the same way. Eli laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "What walks around these mountains on 2 legs and opens a truck like a can?" None of us could answer him. I removed the emergency beacon from its hard case, extended its antenna, and activated it in the center of the clearing. A green light confirmed that our distress signal and location had been transmitted. Under normal conditions, a rescue helicopter might have reached us within a few hours. These were not normal conditions. The clouds were already falling over the ridge, and Warren's weather receiver showed the storm becoming stronger across the western mountains. We had no way to know whether an aircraft could fly through it or whether a ground rescue team would try to reach us using the damaged logging road. Walking out was possible, but it would have been extremely dangerous. The nearest maintained road was almost 40 miles away. The storm was closing in, and something strong enough to destroy the truck had moved around our cabin without being seen. We also had no idea whether the creature had remained near the station or where it had gone after leaving the truck. After discussing our choices, we agreed to remain together and continue restoring the relay station. If we could bring one transmitter online, we could use an emergency frequency to contact the county network. If the beacon brought rescue first, we would leave immediately. If it did not, the abandoned tower might become our only connection to the world outside the mountains. The work helped because it gave us problems we understood. Eli inspected the tower using binoculars before putting on his climbing equipment. I began draining old fuel from the generator and replacing the damaged starter parts. Jonah stayed inside the compound with us while Warren moved between the cabin and tower, studying the road and searching the nearby forest. By midday, I had the generator turning over. It released a cloud of black smoke, shook hard enough to make the enclosure walls vibrate, and eventually settled into an uneven but steady idle. Power reached the control building, but I kept most of its systems disconnected. The old batteries had leaked acid across the floor, filling the room with a sharp chemical smell. We carried the damaged batteries outside one at a time, opened the ventilation panels, and began cleaning 11 years of dust, insect nests, and white mineral buildup from the equipment cabinets. Eli came down from the tower shortly before 2 in the afternoon. After removing his helmet, he continued looking toward the northern trees. I asked whether he had discovered a problem with the tower structure. "The eastern anchor is worse than the report said," he explained. "The concrete is cracked beneath the plate, and one of the upper support cables has lost tension." We can hold it with the portable winch until we install the new hardware, but I don't want to stay up there in strong wind." He became quiet and looked toward the same section of forest again. When I asked what else was wrong, he said, "I saw something moving below the ridge." Jonah immediately picked up his rifle. "What kind of animal?" "I only saw the top of it between the trees. I think it had dark fur. It moved beside the compound for maybe 50 yards, keeping the trees between us, and then disappeared." Jonah asked how large it had been, but Eli could not answer. From his position on the tower, he had seen only its upper body moving through gaps between the trees. Whatever it was had appeared to travel parallel to the fence, and it had never entered the open. Warren returned to the compound approximately an hour later. He had followed the tracks from the truck into the forest for less than a quarter of a mile before losing them on exposed rock. He found no campsite, vehicle tracks, footprints, or sign that another person had been anywhere near the ridge. More importantly, he found only one trail. Whatever had destroyed the truck had approached alone and left alone. Warren showed us several dark hairs he had collected from a broken branch. Each strand was thick, rough, and longer than the hair of any black bear he had examined. He placed them inside an empty plastic bag and said he did not know what animal they belonged to. I could tell from his face that his inability to identify them disturbed him more than he wanted us to know. By late afternoon, the rain had become a solid grey curtain around the compound. The control building was not yet safe to occupy for a long period because of the battery acid and poor air. Most of our bedding, food, medical supplies, and weapons also remained at the cabin. Warren recommended that we stay there for one more night, keep 2 men awake at all times, and move into the reinforced building at first light if rescue had not arrived. At that point, none of us understood what was hunting us. We discussed a bear with a serious deformity, a large animal that had escaped from private ownership, and even someone using a machine or heavy tools to frighten us away from the station. Every explanation sounded incomplete, but they still belonged to the world we knew. None of us was prepared to speak seriously about creatures that were not supposed to exist. We returned to the cabin well before darkness. Jonah and Warren secured the steel shutters, drove long screws through the weaker hinges, and placed a heavy wooden cabinet in front of the rear storage room window. Eli stacked firewood beside the stove while I checked the emergency beacon. Its green light continued to flash, but the device could not tell us whether anyone had received the signal or whether a rescue team was moving toward us. We ate before sunset and discussed how we would defend the cabin if the creature returned. Warren believed the truck had been attacked between 3 and 4 in the morning, close to the time we heard metal bending. He assigned Jonah and himself to the first watch. Eli and I would take over after midnight. No one would open a door or leave the cabin alone, regardless of what we heard outside. I checked the carbine I had brought after Sloan warned us about dangerous wildlife. It was a weapon I had owned since leaving the army, but I had not fired it at anything living. I loaded the magazines, placed them within reach of my chair, and reminded myself that combat experience was not the same as hunting an unknown animal in a dark forest. At 7:30, something walked across the cabin roof. The sound began above the rear bedroom, with one heavy impact followed by another. Dust fell from the ceiling boards. The footsteps moved slowly toward the chimney, paused there, and then crossed back in the opposite direction. Whatever was above us weighed enough to make the roof supports bend and complain beneath it. Jonah raised his shotgun toward the ceiling, but Warren shook his head and pointed upward, reminding him that firing would only create an opening. We extinguished the propane lamps and spread out through the common room. Warren took a position near the rear hallway. Jonah covered the front door. Eli stood beside the kitchen entrance, and I remained near the center of the room with my carbine raised. The footsteps stopped above us. For several minutes, the only sound was the storm. Rain struck the roof, water ran through the gutters, and the wind pushed against the cabin walls. Then something landed behind the building with an impact that made the dishes shake inside the kitchen cabinet. Warren moved to the rear window and opened its narrow viewing slit. He looked outside for no more than 2 seconds before closing it again. Eli whispered, What did you see?" Warren's expression had changed. Until that moment, he had appeared cautious but fully controlled. Now his jaw was tight, and one hand remained pressed against the shutter as though he expected something to pull it open. In a low voice he said, "It crossed behind the woodshed. It was standing upright." A deep sound rolled out of the darkness. It was not the howl of a wolf. It began as a low vibration that seemed to enter the cabin through the floor. The sound slowly rose into something between an animal growl and a human voice being stretched beyond recognition. It continued for several seconds before ending without warning. Eli moved closer to me and asked, "Caleb, what is that?" I kept my weapon aimed toward the rear of the cabin and admitted that I did not know. I had heard wounded animals, wild dogs, wolves, and men making sounds I still remembered from combat. What waited outside did not sound like any of them. Something struck the front shutter hard enough to bend the metal inward. Jonah and I turned toward the window as a second blow landed beside the front door. The entire cabin moved slightly on its foundation. Warren shouted for us to remain in position, but he understood the deception one moment before the rest of us did. The creature had attacked the front of the cabin because it wanted us looking in that direction. The rear storage room wall exploded inward. Boards tore free from their nails. The heavy cabinet overturned, and broken glass scattered across the floor. A huge black arm reached through the opening. Coarse, wet hair covered it from the shoulder to the wrist, but the hand at its end was horribly familiar. It had 4 long fingers and a thumb, each ending in a curved black claw. Warren fired his rifle from less than 10 feet away. The flash filled the room, and the creature released a roar so powerful that I felt it inside my chest. Warren pulled the bolt back, loaded another round, and fired again. Before he could move, the creature's arm swept across the storage room and struck him in the chest. Warren hit the wall, lost his rifle, and fell beside the broken window. Jonah reached him first and grabbed the back of Warren's coat. I seized Warren's left arm and pulled. For one brief moment, we nearly dragged him away from the opening. Then the creature's hand closed around Warren's right shoulder and upper chest from outside. The strength on the other end was greater than anything I had ever experienced. Warren's body shot toward the opening, dragging Jonah and me across the floor. Eli wrapped both arms around my waist and tried to hold all 3 of us. Warren screamed as the broken boards tore through his jacket and cut into his body. His free hand searched for anything he could hold. His fingers pressed against the wooden floor, leaving 4 lines of blood as the creature pulled him closer to the opening. Jonah's grip slipped from Warren's coat. I held Warren's wrist with both hands while Eli pulled me backward. Something outside gave one violent jerk. Pain tore through my shoulder. Warren's skin slid through my fingers, and he disappeared through the broken wall. For 1 second, none of us moved. Then Jonah ran for the front door. I followed him because instinct moved faster than reason. Eli came behind us with a flashlight, while Jonah lifted the wooden bar and threw the door open. Lightning filled the clearing, and for the first time, I saw the creature that had destroyed our truck. It stood nearly 10 feet tall. Its body looked like that of an enormous man forced into the shape of a wolf. Its chest was wider than the cabin doorway. Its arms were long and heavily muscled, and its legs bent like those of a giant hunting animal. Wet, dark brown fur covered most of its body, becoming thinner across its stomach and along the insides of its arms. Its head was shaped like that of a wolf, but it was far too large. Pointed ears lay flat against its skull, and its long muzzle was filled with pale teeth. Warren hung beneath one of its arms. He was still conscious and struggling, and his boots repeatedly struck the creature's legs. Blood covered the front of his coat and ran down one side of the dogman's body. Jonah fired first. The shotgun blast struck the creature high in the back and turned it partly sideways. I raised the carbine and fired 3 rounds. At least 1 bullet struck its ribs because I saw fur and blood leave its side. The dogman did not release Warren. Instead, it turned and deliberately placed Warren's body between itself and our weapons. That movement told me more about the creature than its size or terrible face ever could. It understood the rifles, it understood what they could do, and it understood that we would hesitate to fire through our own man. The dogman stared at us from the edge of the cabin light. Its eyes reflected a dark grey colour, and there was no confusion in them. It had attacked the front of the cabin to draw our attention away from the rear. Now it was using Warren as protection while it decided how close we were willing to come. Then it dropped onto all fours and ran across the clearing with terrifying speed. Warren screamed once as they entered the trees. Jonah fired again, but the shot struck branches. I tried to follow the creature with my carbine, but it moved too quickly, and Warren's body remained between us. Within seconds, the forest had swallowed them both. Jonah stepped from the porch and began running toward the trees. I caught the strap on the back of his jacket and pulled him around. He struck my arm and shouted that Warren was still alive, but I refused to release him. We could no longer see the creature or our security leader. Following the blood trail into a dark forest would give the dogman every advantage. Another roar came from the trees. It was much closer than it should have been. The dogman had either circled back toward the clearing or had never moved as far away as we believed. It might have been warning us not to follow Warren. It might have been trying to make us enter the forest. Jonah stopped fighting me. The three of us returned to the cabin, closed the door, and pushed the heavy table against it. We used loose boards from the storage room to cover part of the opening, then placed the fallen cabinet against what remained of the rear wall. Warren's blood covered the floor from the window to the place where I had lost my grip on him. The dogman did not force its way into the cabin again that night. It moved around the building instead, sometimes stepping heavily enough for us to follow its path, and sometimes passing without making a sound. Once, claws dragged slowly across the outside wall only a few inches from my head. Later, something touched the front door handle and pressed it down carefully. When the table prevented the door from moving, the handle returned to its original position. None of us spoke, unless it was necessary. Jonah sat facing the broken storage room with Warren's rifle across his knees. Eli remained beside the wood stove, holding the flashlight and listening to the roof. I kept my carbine aimed toward the front door, while pain continued to spread through my injured shoulder. Near dawn, something struck the boards, covering the rear opening 3 times. Each impact came several seconds after the one before it. The dogman was not trying to enter. It was testing the barricade we had built after Warren was taken. When pale morning light finally began to through the viewing slits, the movement outside stopped. The forest became completely silent, and nothing touched the cabin again. None of us believed that meant the dogman had left. We remained inside the cabin until full daylight reached the clearing. The rain had weakened, but a cold mist hung between the trees, making the forest appear deeper than it had the previous day. None of us had slept. Jonah sat beside the damaged rear wall with Warren's rifle resting across his knees. Eli kept adding wood to the stove even after the room became too warm, while I held my carbine and listened for any movement beyond the boards covering the opening. My injured shoulder had become stiff, and the skin across both palms was raw from trying to hold Warren. His blood remained on the floor where his fingers had scraped across the wood. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the feeling of his wrist slipping from my hands. Shortly after 7, Jonah stood and said we had waited long enough. He wanted to follow the blood trail while there was daylight. I agreed, but only because I knew he would go without us if I refused. We collected ammunition, medical supplies, flashlights, and the emergency beacon. Eli carried a small axe from the woodshed. I kept my carbine ready while Jonah led with his shotgun. The clearing was empty when we stepped outside. Deep marks crossed the wet ground where the dogman had dropped onto all fours and carried Warren toward the trees. Blood appeared in heavy drops at first, then became a broken line leading into the forest. Warren's first boot lay approximately 40 yards from the cabin. The laces were still tied, and part of his sock remained inside it. Farther ahead, we found a piece of his coat caught high on a broken branch. One of his gloves had been pressed into the mud beside the trail. The dogman's tracks appeared on both sides of the long disturbance left by Warren's body. The prints were the same size as those Warren had measured beside the truck. They showed that the creature had moved on 2 legs after entering the forest. There was only one set of tracks. Whatever had taken Warren had acted alone. At a shallow ravine, we found his rifle. The wooden stock had broken behind the receiver, and the barrel had been bent slightly to one side. Jonah picked it up and tested the bolt. The action still moved, but the weapon could no longer be aimed properly from the shoulder. The ground beyond the rifle contained far more blood. It covered the leaves, stained the roots, and marked the lower trunks of several trees. Jonah followed the trail another 20 yards before stopping beside a large cedar. He did not speak. He simply pointed at the ground. A wide area beneath the tree was soaked with blood. Pieces of Warren's shirt clung to the exposed roots, and a torn strap from his equipment vest lay nearby. The drag marks continued uphill, but the amount of blood told us what none of us wanted to say aloud. No person could lose that much and remain alive for long. Jonah took 2 more steps toward the slope. A low growl came from the mist above us. It was quieter than the roar we had heard during the attack, but it was close. The sound carried no fear or pain, even though we had shot the creature several times. The Dogman had allowed us to follow Warren's trail exactly as far as it wanted. I raised my carbine toward the trees and told everyone to move back slowly. Jonah remained beside the cedar, staring uphill. Rain ran through his hair and down the sides of his face. He said Warren could still be alive and that we could not leave him in the forest. "You know what this blood means," I told him. "If Warren survived the attack, he would not have survived losing this much." Jonah's grip tightened around his shotgun. "We don't leave our people behind. We aren't abandoning him. We bring the relay online, call for a rescue team, and return with enough armed men to search properly. If we continue now, that thing kills all 3 of us." The mist shifted between 2 trees farther uphill. For a moment, I saw a dark shape standing behind them at a height no bear could have reached. It remained completely still. Only part of its shoulder and the pointed top of one ear were visible. The Dogman was not hiding because it feared us. It was watching to see whether grief would make Jonah careless. I placed my hand on Jonah's shoulder and said, "It wants us to follow." Jonah finally saw the dark shape. His expression changed, and he began stepping backward. We retreated without turning around until the ravine and cedar disappeared behind the mist. The Dogman followed far enough for us to hear branches moving beside the trail, but it never entered the open. We abandoned the cabin immediately. The reinforced equipment building smelled of battery acid and diesel, but the damaged batteries had been removed, and the vents had remained open throughout the night. Its concrete walls and steel doors made it the only structure on the ridge that might survive another attack. Moving our supplies required 2 trips between the cabin and compound. We stayed together, with Jonah watching behind us while Eli and I carried food, medical equipment, ammunition, tools, and the remaining water. Every tree seemed to contain part of the creature. Every movement in the fog made us stop and raise our weapons. The Dogman never revealed itself. That frightened me more than another open attack would have. Warren had shot it twice at close range, and we had hit it several more times outside the cabin. Blood on the wall proved that it had been wounded, yet it remained strong enough to follow us. It no longer needed to test our weapons. It had begun testing our attention. Once we were inside the compound, Jonah locked the gate and used steel cable to secure the damaged section of fence. Eli and I returned to the relay system. Our best chance of survival was still to contact the county emergency network before nightfall. The original station had carried emergency radio traffic through 2 microwave links. Veyline had supplied us with a newer digital repeater that could use one of the surviving dishes, but the generator was producing unstable power, the automatic alignment system was dead, and almost 60 feet of exterior feed cable had to be replaced. Under normal conditions, Eli and I would have required most of a day. With the Dogman watching from the forest, every minute felt borrowed. We established one simple rule: no one would leave another man's sight. Jonah guarded the base of the tower while Eli prepared to climb. I worked near the open doorway of the equipment building so I could see both men and reach the generator controls. We kept the floodlights burning despite the daylight because the storm clouds had made the ridge dark. The lights also gave Jonah a clear view of the fence and surrounding trees. Eli climbed with the new cable hanging beneath him. His movements were slower than they had been the previous day. At 60 feet, he secured himself to the tower and examined the damaged section of old feed line. He then called me over the radio and explained that the cable had not broken because of age or weather. Deep cuts crossed the outer cover. Several steel clamps had been twisted away from their mounting points, and the cable had been pulled loose with enough force to bend the brackets. Something had climbed 60 feet up the tower and deliberately torn it away. The scratches on the generator door, the damaged fence, and the destroyed cable suddenly made sense. The Dogman had not wandered onto Rookfall Ridge after our arrival. The relay station had already become part of its territory. It had climbed the tower, moved through the compound, and tested the buildings long before we accepted the contract. Eli reached approximately 80 feet before he stopped moving. His voice came quietly through my radio. North side, beyond the fence. Jonah turned with his shotgun raised. I searched the tree line and saw nothing at first. Then a dark shape separated from the trunk of a cedar approximately 70 yards away. The Dogman stood upright with one hand resting against the tree. Even at that distance, its shoulders appeared far wider than those of any person. A long line of dried blood marked the fur along its ribs where one of our bullets had struck. It was looking past Jonah and me toward Eli. I told Eli to keep climbing without rushing. Jonah followed the Dogman with his shotgun, but it remained partly protected by the tree. It stayed there for almost a minute, watching Eli attach the new cable and watching Jonah adjust his position. When I returned my attention to the control cabinet for only a few seconds, the creature disappeared. By early afternoon, the new feed cable had reached the equipment building. I connected it to the replacement repeater while Eli climbed higher to reach the microwave dish. The dish had moved far enough that its signal no longer reached the next station. With the automatic system dead, Eli had to adjust it by hand while I listened for a response through the monitor speaker. At first, I heard only static. Eli moved the dish several degrees, and a broken voice appeared beneath the noise before fading again. I asked him to move it back slowly. The voice returned, stronger this time. "Hold that position," I said. I selected the county emergency frequency and pressed the transmitter. "Rookfall Ridge relay calling any station receiving. Emergency traffic. 4-person Veoline crew stranded at Rookfall Ridge. 1 man missing and presumed critically injured. Vehicle destroyed. Dangerous animal active near the site. Emergency beacon deployed. Do you copy?" Static answered me. I repeated the message. On my third attempt, a woman's voice came through the speaker. The signal faded in and out, but it was the first human voice from outside the mountains that we had heard since arriving. The dispatcher identified herself as Holopine County Emergency Communications. I gave her our location, the number of survivors, our injuries, the condition of the access road, and the weapons we carried. When she asked what had attacked us, I described the creature as clearly as I could. I told her it was between 9 and 10 feet tall when upright, covered in dark fur, able to move on 2 legs or 4, and strong enough to tear open a truck. I did not use the word Dogman. I was afraid that if I did, she might believe we were confused or injured and stop treating the warning seriously. The dispatcher asked me to repeat the creature's height. After I did, she became quiet for several seconds and then continued recording the details without questioning me. Our emergency beacon had been detected shortly after sunrise, but low clouds and strong winds had prevented a helicopter from crossing the range. A ground team had also turned back when a fallen tree blocked the logging road. A rescue helicopter and armed search team would try to reach us after sunrise the following morning. We were told to remain inside the strongest available building and keep the radio frequency open. I confirmed the instructions and was beginning to explain Warren's disappearance when the generator stopped. The control building became silent. The floodlights died, the ventilation fan slowed, and the repeater switched to the temporary battery I had installed. Late afternoon had already become almost as dark as evening beneath the storm clouds. Jonah moved to the doorway while I checked the power panel. There had been no warning from the generator. The engine had not failed. Its electrical output had been disconnected. Through the narrow window, we saw the armoured power cable hanging across the gravel between the generator enclosure and the building. Its connector had been torn from the transfer box. A large shadow moved behind the generator and disappeared. Eli had descended only as far as the 40-foot platform. He pressed himself against the tower and looked down at the dark compound. Through the radio, he said, "It waited until we made contact." The Dogman might not have understood what the relay did, but it understood that the generator produced light and that we had worked desperately to keep it running. It had watched us repair the system, waited until Eli was trapped above the ground, and then removed the power with a single pull. The creature struck the fence on the northern side. Chain link bent inward and then returned to place. A few seconds later, another impact came from the south. It was moving around the compound faster than Jonah could follow, striking the fence and disappearing before he could aim. The repeater's temporary battery would last approximately 20 minutes, but the dispatcher already had our location. The larger problem was surviving the coming night. The equipment building was strong, but the air vents and roof access panel could not resist the Dogman forever. It had torn through the cabin wall, and the steel door already carried scratches from earlier visits. Another blow hit the fence. One of the upper support rails bent several inches. I looked toward the tower plans spread across the workbench. The drawings showed the 3 anchor groups that held the steel tower upright. Eli had already told me that the eastern anchor foundation was badly cracked. Until we could install the replacement hardware, we had supported it using Verline's portable cable winch and a temporary retaining chain. The tower was our only connection to rescue, but it was also 160 feet of heavy steel held upright by several tons of force. I called Eli and asked, "If the eastern anchor fails, which way does the tower fall?" He looked toward the cables before answering. "West. The western lines will pull the mast toward them, especially with this wind. The lower section could break first, but most of it should fall across the western half of the compound." "Can we release the anchor deliberately?" Eli became silent. Another impact shook the fence before he answered. "The temporary chain is carrying most of the load. The 3 eastern cables connect to the same damaged plate. If we remove the locking pin and release the chain, the foundation should break away." Jonah understood what I was considering. "You want to bring the tower down on it." "Our bullets injured it, but they didn't stop it. The tower might. What happens if it doesn't stand in the right place? Then we lose the tower and still have the Dogman." It was not a good plan, but it was the first one that offered enough force to kill something of that size. We needed to reconnect the generator, bring Eli down, prepare the anchor release, and draw the creature beneath the western side of the tower. If any part happened too soon or too late, one of us would be crushed instead. Jonah covered the doorway while I went outside to reconnect the power. The rain struck my face, and the compound seemed much larger in the darkness. I stayed low and moved behind the generator enclosure. The cable had not simply come loose. The Dogman had torn the heavy connector apart and twisted the metal housing away from the wall. I attached an emergency lead directly between the generator and the control building. It was not safe enough for normal use, but it only needed to last a few minutes. When the lead touched the terminal, the generator came under load and the floodlights flashed on. The Dogman stood on the other side of the fence less than 30 feet from me. Its lips pulled back from its teeth. Blood had dried across the fur on its chest, shoulder, and ribs, but the wounds looked small compared with the size of its body. Its dark grey eyes moved from my face to the carbine hanging against my chest. The creature knew I had seen it reach the fence, and it knew how long it would take me to raise the weapon. I grabbed the carbine. The Dogman disappeared behind the generator enclosure before I could fire. I ran toward the control building. Claws struck the gravel behind me with a speed that made my stomach tighten. Jonah fired from the doorway, forcing the Dogman to change direction. The shot passed beside its shoulder, but the creature had already moved behind the building where Jonah could no longer see it. I reached the door, turned, and saw the Dogman jump over the 8-foot fence without touching the wire along the top. It landed inside the compound on all fours, sending gravel outward beneath its weight. Jonah fired again. The shotgun blast struck the creature's left shoulder and tore away a patch of fur. The Dogman fell against the side of the building, but it recovered almost immediately. Instead of rushing Jonah, it moved behind the generator enclosure and disappeared from his line of sight. It remembered where the doors were and understood where Jonah could aim. Eli began descending the tower. He moved as quickly as his safety equipment allowed, releasing one hook at a time while keeping the other attached. The Dogman moved beneath him, but did not begin climbing. It seemed to understand that Eli had nowhere else to go. I fired several rounds into the gravel near the creature and forced it away from the tower base. Eli descended the final section, released his climbing line, and ran toward the eastern anchor. I followed him while Jonah remained near the equipment building. The portable winch stood beside the cracked concrete foundation. 3 support cables connected to a single steel plate held partly in place by the temporary chain. Eli removed the safety catch and passed a thinner steel cable through the locking pin. The cable would allow us to pull the pin from approximately 30 feet away. "When the pin comes free, the anchor plate could break immediately," Eli explained. "The tower will fall west. We have to remain east of the base." A scraping sound moved across the roof of the equipment building. The Dogman had climbed above Jonah's line of sight. Eli and I backed toward the eastern wall while carrying the release cable. The floodlights cast hard shadows beneath the tower and across the western side of the compound. Jonah appeared in the western doorway. He saw the cable in our hands and understood the plan without needing an explanation. His job would be to draw the creature beneath the falling tower. Eli and I would release the anchor from the safer side. The Dogman dropped from the roof between us. It landed upright with enough force to crack the gravel beneath its feet. I was close enough to smell wet fur, blood, and the sour odor beneath both. Under the floodlights, the creature appeared even larger than it had outside the cabin. Its chest rose above my head, and its shoulders were wider than the space between the equipment racks inside the building. Thick muscles moved beneath its dark fur. Old, pale scars crossed its muzzle and chest, showing that it had survived violence long before meeting us. Its grey eyes moved toward Eli and then returned to me. The creature looked down at the release cable in my hands. For one terrible moment, I believed it understood exactly what we intended to do. Jonah shouted from the western doorway and fired. The shotgun blast struck the Dogman low in the back. It turned toward him but did not charge immediately. Instead, it moved around the tower base, keeping the steel structure between itself and Jonah's weapon. Jonah stepped farther into the open and fired again. The second blast struck the creature near its hip. The Dogman stumbled, recovered, and began moving toward him. It still used the tower to protect most of its body. Eli and I crawled east with the release cable. We needed the creature several yards farther west before dropping the tower. If we released the anchor too early, the lower section might strike behind it and leave it unharmed. Jonah continued moving backward. The western fence stood only 20 feet behind him. He fired again and struck the Dogman in the chest. The creature released a roar and charged. It crossed the distance so quickly that Jonah barely raised the shotgun before the Dogman reached him. One of its hands struck the barrel and bent it away. The second hit Jonah across the chest and lifted him from the ground. He flew backward into the fence, which bent beneath his weight. His shotgun landed several feet away. The Dogman lowered itself over him. "Now!" Eli shouted. I pulled the release cable. The locking pin moved less than an inch before stopping. The full force of the eastern support lines was pressing against it. I wrapped the cable around my forearm and leaned backward, but the pin would not move. Jonah tried to crawl away. The Dogman stepped on the back of his jacket and pulled him toward itself. He reached for the shotgun, but his fingers stopped several inches short of the weapon. Eli grabbed the cable beside me. Together, we planted our feet against the equipment building foundation and pulled with all our strength. My injured shoulder burned, and the cable cut through my glove. The locking pin tore free with a sharp metal crack. The temporary chain released. The damaged eastern anchor plate broke out of the concrete, throwing pieces of stone across the compound. 3 support cables snapped upward and cut through the rain. For one moment, the tower remained upright. Then the western cables tightened, the lower mast bent, and thousands of pounds of steel began falling. Jonah saw it coming. He rolled beneath the raised edge of the generator enclosure and covered his head. The Dogman looked up. It understood the danger quickly enough to release Jonah and run, but one of the tower's lower cables swept across the compound and wrapped around its left leg. The creature fell onto its side, clawed at the gravel, and began pulling itself toward the trees. The upper half of the tower struck first. Steel sections tore through the western fence and crushed several small trees beyond it. A microwave dish broke from its frame and landed near the service road. The lower tower folded a fraction of a second later. One steel crossbar struck the Dogman across the back and drove it into the ground. Another section landed across its legs. The impact shook the ridge. Windows cracked in the equipment building, the generator jumped on its concrete base, and I was thrown against the wall. The floodlights went dark when the emergency power lead tore free. For several seconds, I could hear nothing except damaged metal bending beneath its own weight. Then the Dogman began to move. The crossbar across its back lifted several inches. Bolts screamed against steel as the creature pushed upward. Its left leg was trapped and twisted beneath the collapsed tower, but it used both arms to drag itself forward. One clawed hand reached through the wreckage and dug into the gravel. Jonah remained beneath the edge of the generator enclosure. Blood ran from his forehead and his left arm rested at an unnatural angle. He appeared conscious but unable to move. The Dogman pulled itself toward him. My carbine had fallen somewhere beneath the eastern cables. I ran west before Eli could stop me. Warren's broken rifle lay beside the equipment building door where Jonah had placed it. I picked it up, pulled the bolt back, and confirmed that a round remained inside the chamber. The broken stock made the weapon difficult to hold, but the barrel was only slightly bent, and at close range accuracy would not matter. The Dogman saw me moving through the wreckage. Its right arm swept beneath the collapsed tower and struck my side. I felt 2 ribs break before my feet left the ground. I landed several yards away and lost the rifle. For a moment, I could not breathe. The creature forced its head beneath a triangular opening in the steel. Blood covered its muzzle, and one ear hung torn against its skull. Its jaws opened, revealing teeth longer than my fingers. A low, broken sound came from its throat. It was quieter than a roar and almost sounded like laughter. Jonah crawled out from beneath the generator shelter and reached for his damaged shotgun. The Dogman extended one arm toward him. Its claws caught Jonah's jacket and pulled him several inches closer. Eli ran from the eastern side carrying a heavy tower wrench. He struck the creature's hand with enough force to break one of its fingers. The Dogman released Jonah and swung toward Eli. A claw caught Eli across the shoulder and threw him against the collapsed fence. The impact gave me enough time to reach Warren's rifle. I crawled through the gravel, caught the broken stock, and forced myself onto one knee. Every breath sent pain through my ribs. The Dogman pushed against the tower again. The steel crossbar rose farther, and part of its trapped leg came free. If it escaped the wreckage, none of us had enough strength or ammunition to survive another attack. I moved closer because the bent rifle could not be trusted at a distance. The Dogman reached through the steel and clawed at my jacket. One claw cut across my chest, but the tower stopped its arm before it reached deeper. I pushed the rifle barrel through the triangular opening until it was less than a foot from the creature's face. Its dark grey eyes fixed on mine. There was pain in them, but there was also understanding. It knew what the rifle was, and it knew what I was about to do. I fired into its left eye. The Dogman's head snapped backward. Its entire body struck the tower, lifting one section of steel before falling again. I pulled the bolt back, but the damaged stock slipped against my arm. The empty casing jammed for a moment before falling into the gravel. The creature was still alive. One hand closed around a steel beam, and its chest began rising again. I forced another round into the chamber, pushed the rifle beneath its jaw, and fired upward. The Dogman convulsed with enough force to move the tower several inches. Its claws opened and closed against the gravel. A final breath left its mouth in a wet, shaking sound. Then its arms collapsed beneath the steel. None of us moved for almost a minute. Eli eventually found my carbine near the eastern anchor. He approached the creature carefully, placed the muzzle close to the base of its skull, and fired one additional round. The Dogman did not react. Jonah crawled out from beneath the generator shelter while holding his left arm against his chest. The arm was broken, and 4 claw marks had opened his jacket, but the cuts beneath were not deep. Eli had a wound across his shoulder and another along his temple. My broken ribs made every breath feel as if something sharp was moving inside me. The Dogman lay partly exposed beneath the wreckage. Even in death, its size was difficult to understand. One hand was larger than my chest. Its forearm was nearly as thick as Eli's waist. The tracks Warren measured had not shown the full length of its feet because the rain had softened the rear claw marks. Blood flowed between the gravel stones and gathered beneath the section of collapsed fence. Jonah stood over the body for several seconds before quietly saying, "That thing took Warren." I understood what he wanted to do. Part of me wanted the same thing, but the creature was already dead. Nothing we did to its body would bring Warren back. We used Verline's inspection camera to photograph the Dogman from several angles. Eli placed a measuring tape beside its hand and 1 foot so the images would show its true size. Afterward, we returned to the equipment building, locked both steel doors, and treated our injuries. The tower had been destroyed, but the county dispatcher possessed our location and knew that we required urgent help. 1 small reserve battery kept a handheld receiver active, although the fallen antenna prevented us from transmitting. Night settled over Rookfall Ridge for the 2nd time. Without the tower rising above it, the compound felt exposed to the entire mountain. We kept the interior lights off and took turns watching through the narrow reinforced window. The Dogman's body remained beneath the twisted steel, a large dark shape beside the broken fence. Sometime after midnight, metal groaned outside. Eli listened and said the fallen tower was settling into the ground. The sound came again, followed by a long scrape across the gravel. I looked through the window, but the darkness hid most of the western compound. None of us considered opening the door. We had watched the Dogman stop breathing, but the fear that it might rise again remained stronger than reason. The scraping continued for less than a minute. After that, the ridge became silent. We heard the rescue helicopter shortly after 8 the following morning. Its rotor noise moved between the mountains before the aircraft appeared beneath the clouds. It circled the ruined compound and landed in the clearing beside the cabin. 2 county deputies, 2 search and rescue medics, and a state wildlife officer came uphill carrying rifles and medical equipment. I unlocked the steel door. Before anyone could ask what had happened, Jonah pointed toward the fallen tower. The Dogman was gone. At first, I thought part of the wreckage concealed it. Several tower sections had shifted during the night, and the crossbar that had pinned the creature stood several inches higher than before. However, the hollow beneath it was empty. Blood covered the gravel, dark fur clung to the steel, and 1 bent support held a strip of skin. There was no body. The wildlife officer introduced herself as Dana Kessler. She followed the blood through the section of fence crushed by the tower. Beyond the compound, a deep furrow crossed the wet ground and entered the trees. Something had pulled the Dogman from beneath the collapsed steel and dragged it west. The trail was nearly 3 feet wide. Broken branches, blood, and patches of dark fur marked its path. At several points, the body had struck rocks hard enough to leave pieces of tissue behind. Kessler examined the depth of the furrow, the damaged tower, and the photographs on our inspection camera. Based on the size of the creature and the pressure marks in the ground, she estimated that it had weighed at least 1,200 pounds and possibly closer to 1,500. 1 deputy looked back toward the collapsed tower and asked, "What could drag 1,500 pounds out from under all that steel?" No one answered him. We followed the trail for approximately 600 yards. It climbed through thick forest, crossed an area of soft ground, and ended in the center of a narrow clearing. The furrow did not slowly become lighter. It stopped at once, as though the entire body had been lifted from the ground. Beside the end of the trail, Kessler found a footprint. It had the same long heel, 5 narrow toes, and deep claw marks as the prints Warren had measured beside our truck. This one was more than 20 inches long. A second print lay almost 7 feet ahead and had sunk so deeply into the earth that rainwater filled it. Beyond that point, the larger footprints continued, but the drag marks did not. Whatever had removed the Dogman had lifted a body weighing between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds and carried it away. The footprints led toward an area of exposed granite, where they disappeared. When members of the search team followed them in the opposite direction, they discovered that they came down from a rock shelf overlooking Rookfall Ridge. From that shelf, the cabin, truck, tower compound, and western side of the clearing were all visible. 4 deep impressions remained near the edge, where something extremely heavy had stood for a long time. That was the first evidence that there had been another Dogman. The search for Warren continued until the following afternoon. A larger ground team arrived when the logging road became passable. They found his second boot almost half a mile from the cabin. More pieces of his clothing, the remains of his equipment vest, and blood on both sides of a game trail leading north. They never found his body. Later testing confirmed that all the blood belonged to Warren. Investigators concluded that the amount he lost made survival impossible. 3 weeks later, his family buried an empty coffin. Veoline paid the $18,000 completion bonus, even though the restored tower lay across part of the forest. The company also paid for my hospital treatment and offered me a contract that required me never to speak publicly about what happened. I refused to sign it. The official report described the attack as an encounter with an unidentified large animal. Our inspection camera was collected as evidence. When I requested copies of the photographs several months later, I was informed that the memory card had been damaged during recovery. Jonah never accepted another wilderness security job. Eli continued working on towers, but only at locations within sight of a maintained road. I returned to communication repair because it was the only trade I had ever known. I never accepted another isolated contract, regardless of the money offered. For a long time I told myself the second creature had arrived after the fight. That explanation allowed me to sleep. It had found the blood, recovered one of its own kind, and carried the body into the mountains. There was something almost natural about that version of events. Then I remembered the rock shelf overlooking the compound. The Dogman we killed had been intelligent enough to destroy our truck and satellite terminal before revealing itself. It attacked the front of the cabin to draw our attention away from the rear. It used Warren's body to protect itself from our weapons. It watched us repair the relay, waited until we contacted the dispatcher, and then cut the power. During every encounter, it learned something new about us. The larger one had stood above the entire ridge. From that shelf, it could have watched the truck being destroyed. It could have watched Warren being taken, Eli climbing the tower, and the 3 of us preparing our final trap. It saw which weapons injured the Dogman, and which ones failed. It watched frightened, desperate human beings discover how to kill something larger and stronger than any of us. We spent that entire night believing there was only one of them. In a way, we were right. Only one Dogman had been hunting us. The other had been learning. The first Dogman did not survive the lesson. The difference is that the second one did.